Welcome to the latest Fluence Forum. I'm Blois Olson, and the topic this time is elections, election administration, election security. As we enter early voting here in Minnesota, I think it's important that we lay out kind of how the election is going to process. There's been so many questions and discussions about election these past 2 years, 4 years, that getting back to the basics and understanding the way in which elections have been administered, the law, and things like that, is just to set the stage and set the basics in place before early voting starts here. Our sponsor today is AARP of Minnesota, and I want to thank them. My first guest this time on this Fluence Forum is Judd Choate. He is the state elections director in Colorado. He is also adjunct faculty at the Humphrey School. He has a PhD in political science and has followed, taught, analyzed the various pieces of elections, election security, and election law that have been the topic of discussion in so many corners of our country and our state. Judd, thanks for joining me on this Fluence Forum.
Nice to be here.
Judd, can you just kind of start with an overview of the way, academics and those people who operate or oversee elections view the state of elections and election security, from threats that have existed to just basic facts and, making sure that we all can have an agreeable set of facts?
Well, contrary to what you might read in the paper or see in the deep, dark recesses of the internet, elections are run in a safe, accurate, secure way, more so than at any time in U.S. history. And the United States of America runs the best elections in the world. So we have a lot to be proud of on the elections front. And there are always things that we can get better at. But many of the criticisms that you might read about or hear about from your uncle who shows up on Thanksgiving are not accurate, and they don't accurately represent where we are with elections administration.
So one of the things here in Minnesota is that obviously during the pandemic, the administration or the rules of voting changed in Minnesota. Was that common across the country? And is there any research that showed that it changed any participation levels or any change in machines or counting of ballots?
Yeah, it was common. Most U.S. states had some changes to the way they operated their election system based on the pandemic. There were many needs for either voters or elections administrators that required either advancements in technology or changes in mode. Minnesota's a case in point where they saw an increase in the percentage of people using mail ballots. I'm in Colorado. Colorado is an all-male state, so we didn't really see that. But what we did see is a change in behavior for in-person voters, and that we see all around the country. Prior to the 2020 election, there were really only 3 states that operated mail ballot elections sort of universally. That now is up to 7 states, and that's largely because of the success of the 2020 election. I think a lot of people felt in the lead up to the 2020 election that this election was set up for failure. There were so many things sort of pitted against it, but instead it was an incredibly successful election, and it saw a sort of incredible increase in voter participation. And a lot of that was because states which had previously been intransigent about expanding voter access to ballots did it for COVID reasons. And as a result, they saw an increase in participation. And then many of those states adopted those policies more universally. So now they do them as in their standard course of business. Of course, there were other states that went the other way. And so we see a larger and larger gulf between the haves and have-nots in terms of the states that provide ballot access sort of easily, like a state like Colorado or a state like Minnesota, which is sort of world renowned for its voter turnout. And then a state like Texas, or Mississippi or South Carolina, some states which have seen some pretty significant backtracks in the availability of ballots and frankly making elections more difficult, more complicated.
Judd, you talk about Colorado being a mail-in ballot state. Minnesota, obviously, you have kind of no excuse absentee or request ballots and mail them back. Can you talk about how Colorado got to all mail before the pandemic and what the pros and cons are of a mail-in election or a mail-in ballot election?
Sure. The way that Colorado got there was that, first of all, Minnesota is sort of this way, but Colorado is a big, wide chunk of real estate with not a lot of people in it. There are highly concentrated areas of population, but for the most part, it's not very densely populated. And so a voting regime where ballots are in people's hands and they don't have to drive 30 miles or 50 miles to get to a polling place just makes a lot of sense for a jurisdiction like this. It's also why states like Utah, Montana, Arizona, Oregon, Washington, California have all adopted either universal vote by mail or a broad vote by mail policy. The way Colorado got to full vote by mail was that we became a no excuse absentee state back in the 1990s, and then sort of gradually moved into more and more people adopting vote by mail. And the sort of carrot that got people involved was we made it okay for people to permanently sign up to receive their ballots by mail. So we created this online mechanism where people could sign up to always get their ballots by mail.
Okay.
So we saw that number go from 15% to 30. And in 2008, we were at 60%. So 60% of our population had requested to receive their ballots by mail. And so after that, in 2013, we passed a law that said, look, everybody gets a ballot in the mail. That will be our ballot delivery system. If you don't want to vote in your mail ballot, that's totally fine. Just come in person. You can vote in person if you want to. You can vote on a machine if you want to. Every polling place has one. But in the meantime, we're going to hand you a ballot, and we're going to do that through the mail. So that's how we did that in 2013. That made Colorado the third state to adopt vote by mail behind Oregon, which was the birthplace, and then Washington State. And now, like I say, we're up to 7 states.
Judd, I want to kind of focus on that model in Colorado because it is, people talk about access to ballots, that, there's this idea that perpetrates some sort of fraud. How do you verify the ballots coming back? Without going into kind of the technical details, but can you walk through the process to verify that it's a real ballot from a real person who got it, and how the integrity is preserved?
Yeah, so it's a couple of things to think about when you think about sort of integrity of a mail ballot election. The first one is we are mailing those ballots to an address with a name attached to that address. So in effect, we are testing that address. We're testing to make sure that person actually lives at that address. There are conditions where a person who doesn't live at an address might receive mail there, but that's a pretty low order of business. Most of the time, we're sending to addresses where people actually live. So that's one thing. We're testing addresses.
Okay.
I would just note that most in-person polling place states, so this is much of the Northeast and some of the Southeast, they are just relying on somebody coming in and saying, yes, I still live at the address I say I live at.
Okay.
And so where we have the potential of mail ballot fraud, where somebody might receive somebody else's ballot, vote it, and then sign the back of it, and then that address is reviewed, and maybe it gets through because the person knows how the voter signs. That is a pretty low order of possibility, but it can happen. In those other kinds of polling mechanisms or modes, a person can come in and say, I live here, when in fact they don't. And there's really no way to check it. There's no way to verify. And in fact, the data shows that there's a lot more what you might call voter fraud. in that mechanism than there are in the mechanisms employed by vote by mail states.
My guest is Judd Chody. He's faculty at the Humphrey School. He's also the state election director in the state of Colorado. We're talking about kind of administering elections post 2020 in the 2022 elections. So, Judd, as you look at security, both of ballots and machines, and what should voters be confident of what you teach to election administrators, where the verifications are, where the double checks happen, so that people are confident that their vote counts, and or that only one vote per person in these states?
Yeah, so election security, I'll just divide it up into kind of three pieces. The first piece is that the equipment itself is tested and certified. It's tested by a couple of federal labs. Those labs are themselves certified to test that equipment. They must meet a federal certification to do the testing. And then each state has its own certification requirements. Some of those are based in federal law. Some of them are specific to the state. But regardless, we then test the equipment through those certified testing labs and do any manner of tests to check to see how it works, whether it works properly, whether it assigns credit properly, and then whether it's properly secured, whether it has the necessary security elements to prevent somebody from hacking into that equipment and changing the way that somebody voted, or adding votes or subtracting votes. So all of that is done through the certified review. So that's number one. Number two is that in Colorado, as in I'm sure every state, I know in Minnesota, there are very stringent requirements regarding chain of custody of all voting and elections related equipment. So every time a piece of equipment goes from one spot to another, is loaded into a truck and then taken to a polling place and unloaded and installed and put into use, each one of those changes in condition require either a person or a bipartisan team to sign off on that change of condition. And so we can track exactly where a piece of equipment has been and whether it was alone with a person. And if we find that, in fact, there's something about that chain of custody that is worrisome, we can go back to that piece of equipment and reinstall what's called trusted build, which is the trusted version of that software. So even if there's any concerns whatsoever, even if it's as minor as we're worried that only one person, Judd, was only with that equipment for 15 minutes. Well, if you're worried about me, or if there's some reason that is concerning, you can always go back to that piece of equipment and load the trusted version of that software. So we do that through the course of any election cycle and in between elections to make sure that piece of equipment is always on the most recent version of that software and hasn't been tampered with. And then the third thing that we do is both before an election and then after an election, we test that equipment to make sure that it's working properly and that it's recording the votes properly, it's counting it properly, it's tabulating properly. We do that before an election with a bipartisan team, in addition to local elections officials, all sitting in a room. Usually it also includes county and party officials, where they sit in a room and they test ballots. They might test literally thousands of ballots through the scanners and out of the ballot marking devices or DREs to make sure that those reported votes are being counted properly by the software and hardware that's doing that tabulation. We do that before the election, but then after the election, we do the same thing through our auditing functions. And Minnesota, Colorado, many other states, in fact, over 40 states in the country do post-election audits, vigorous post-election audits. So it's all those pieces. It's all those pieces together which create sort of an umbrella of security over these systems where we can feel very confident that they're doing the job and doing it properly.
Jed, this might sound like kind of a odd angle on the question, but as you teach people elections, election security, election administration, what kind of people are attracted to this? Are they people who have been civil servants in other ways? Is it a growing academic field? I'm just kind of curious, as somebody who, went to school, studied a lot of things in politics and government, but election administration or security was never even, I don't think, on my radar.
Well, it's funny, it's changed. I know when I first became the state election director in Colorado, people would ask me, how do you become one of those? What's the resume necessary to get a job like that? And there was really no answer. I mean, nobody grew up, saying, boy, I look forward to someday being an elections professional. Nobody says that. And so who are the people that serve as elections administrators in Minnesota and elsewhere? They typically are public servants who have worked in various forms of state, local government, maybe even national government, who have, for various reasons, sort of ended up in a county clerk's office or in a municipal clerk's office or work at the Secretary of State's office. And because of their skill and their education, their willingness to do hard work and work long hours, they have sort of risen to that position to do that work. So that's sort of the history of it. But I have to tell you, after 2020, that's kind of changed. And you might think, oh no, that's changed for the worse. Well, these election deniers are trying to get into these jobs. Yeah, some of that is happening. But actually what's really happening is a whole bunch of people that had no idea that elections administration was a thing are now applying for programs like at the University of Minnesota Humphrey Institute, where they can learn how to be an elections administrator and kind of get a jump start on that process I described, and maybe put themselves in a position to get into leadership management positions in elections administration, probably on a fast track because of their ability to become educated in that field.
Judd Choate, I really want to appreciate and say thanks for joining me on this Fluence Forum. Very informative. And when we come back, two of those people from the Secretary of State's office, Melanie Hayslip and Paul Linnell, they'll lay out how Minnesota's 2022 election will be administered, what the rules are, how to get ballots, and what the expectation should be. That's next on this Fluence Forum presented by AARP of Minnesota. We're back for the second segment here of this Fluence Forum presented by AARP Minnesota. We're focused on elections and voting as it gets ready to start here in Minnesota. What's the process? What are the rules? How is 2022 going to roll out and be different than 2020, which was different than anything before? Joining me for this next segment is Melanie Hayslip. She's the Director of Voter Outreach, and Paul Linnell, the Deputy Director of Elections. Both are with the Minnesota Secretary of State. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So, when does voting start, and how does it work in 2022 for folks to either early vote or request their absentee ballot?
Well, voting season is just around the corner, with early voting starting on September 23rd, so 1 week from today. We are encouraging all Minnesotans to make sure that they're ready for the election now. Our website, mnvotes.gov, is your one-stop shop for all of your election and voting needs. And it's where you can update your registration, register if you're not, request an absentee ballot, track your ballot, view a sample ballot that you'll be filling out when you go to the polls, and find your polling place. And we have 3 ways that you can vote in Minnesota. As I said, early voting begins on September 23rd, and that is when the mail-in ballots will start to be mailed out to folks who have requested them. So if you would like to mail in your ballot, vote absentee early, you can go to our website, mnvotes.gov, and fill out the application for an absentee ballot. That ballot will then be mailed out to you by your local county's elections office starting September 23rd. And once you receive it, you fill out your ballot and you mail it back in. It's easy as that. 2 new rules that are going, actually, they're not new, but they're going back to the pre-2020 rules. COVID changed some things, like you mentioned, that we want to highlight for mail-in ballots are One, you will need a signature on the witness signature envelope again this year. That was suspended last election due to COVID. And then two, your mail-in ballot will need to be received by election day, by November 8th, election day. That was also suspended in 2020. You also have the option to vote early in person, and mnvotes.gov will tell you where your local county elections office is. And you go during office hours, fill out that absentee ballot. It's the same ballot that we use for the mail-in ballots, but you can fill it out in person at your local elections office and then just hand it in, and there you go. You know you voted. With the mail-in ballots, I should mention that you can actually track your ballot through the process. You can go to our website and we have a tracking tool where you just follow the ballot all the way through until you know that it's been voted. You've voted and it's been counted. It has a barcode on it that connects it to you as a voter, just like a package that you would order in the mail. And so you can track that ballot all the way through to make sure that your vote was counted. And then lastly, of course, you can go on November 8th on election day and go vote in person. And because of redistricting this year, we are telling folks to make sure they double check where their polling place is. With redistricting, we had all of the maps redrawn in Minnesota as a result of the 2020 census count to reflect the change in population. And so many polling places did change. So go to mnvotes.gov and make sure you know where your polling place is. So those are the three ways to vote.
Melanie, thanks for that. Paul, as we think about MN votes and the Secretary of State's role in administering elections, will you talk about how the interface is between the Secretary of State and the counties for the actual administration of the election and making sure ballots represent the precinct or the races for each voter, and how that relationship works and how you work with the counties?
Sure, absolutely. So at the Office of the Secretary of State, obviously the Secretary serves as the chief state election official and serves to train and certify county election administrators. So in that training role and providing guidance to the counties, ensuring that information is accurate and up to date. The statewide voter registration system is hosted here at the state, but it is at the county level that the county auditor and elections managers are overseeing and inputting voter registration information as well as that absentee ballot information. So a lot of work was done this year in particular, as Melanie mentioned, with the redistricting piece, making sure that new precinct boundaries were input and up to date, that those accurately reflected the maps as approved, those new boundaries by the legislature or by the courts in this case. And then a lot of back-end work verifying that those the information that's on there is correct before getting into ahead of the primary season, and now again with the general election. So that's taking place, I think, throughout the process, and certainly to make sure that all of that info is right and it's reflected then when the voter goes to use some of these tools, as Melanie mentioned, like the poll finder that will show them not only where their polling place is located, but also all of their election districts, what their new, if it's changed, their Senate, House district, who their representative is, and who's going to be on their ballot.
Oh, thanks for that, Melanie. Minnesota is known for high voter turnout. How do you anticipate what turnout's going to be? How do you prepare for turnout? Does every precinct get enough ballots? How does that how is that determined? Is that determined by the state, by the county? Because you hear of people, at times running out of ballots or something like that. How do you make sure that everybody has the resources they need when it comes to both, the walk up, but especially on election day?
Before I hand this back over to Paul to answer this question, I'll just take a second to highlight that we have had the #1 voter turnout in the last 3 elections in a row. We always like to brag about that here at the Office of the Secretary of State, and we expect to have #4 this year. But Paul will have a better answer for you on that one.
Yeah, and I think that's a good starting point, is that we know that we've got high turnout, and I think that's something that the counties are regularly planning for when determining ballot quantities. And how to allocate those. I would say the calculus has gotten maybe a little bit trickier in terms of identifying what percentage of those are going to be cast absentee and what percentage of those are going to be at the polling place. In some cases, those might be different types of ballots that are ordered, whether they're kind of pre-folded or actually ordered through a service to send those ballots out directly. But it certainly evolved as the percentage of voters that have cast their ballots prior to Election Day has increased. So we've seen that trend steadily since 2014, and certainly 2020 saw some all-time highs there. So we don't know that we'll quite hit those same levels. We know a lot of the mail absentee voting and early voting maybe was in part due to concerns around crowding in a polling place on Election Day. So it may revert down to a level closer to pre-2020 in terms of that early voting, but that's definitely taken into account. It's maybe not an exact science of how much to order, but it's often referred to as cheap insurance to order more ballots than you might need, because the last thing you want to do is run out and not have enough.
Melanie, you were bragging about our number one standing and hopefully being number one again. Is there a sense that have we learned anything from other states about mail-in ballots? Knowing that behavior changed in 2020, are voters engaged in any different kinds of thinking, or we've seen from other states, or anything we even learned from our August primary?
Yeah, I think that we're seeing, because of 2020, because many voters were sort of forced to consider their voting habits in a different way than they had previously, we are seeing more people are comfortable with mail-in ballots than they were pre-2020. And other states that have a high percentage of mail-in ballots seem to have a higher percentage of voter turnout as well. So I think as we continue in this post-2020 election world and more folks realize that voting from home is an option that's easy, and like I said, you can track your ballot all the way through the process. It's such a accessible way to vote for many people. I think we'll continue to see more people choosing mail-in ballots.
Paul, obviously security has become a talking heads issue. It's become a headline issue. It's become, unfortunately, the source of some misinformation over the years, especially since 2020. When you think about the chain of custody of a ballot, is there anything that voters should know that is either law or best practice that the counties should follow or that the state recommends?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is that the chain of custody and the checks that are required by statute are in place, whether you're voting at the polling place, whether you're voting early absentee, or whether you're voting absentee by mail. So as Melanie mentioned, with the absentee voting process, that really starts with a voter applying, filling out an application that will include their driver's license number, the last four of their social security number, creating an absentee ballot record that then gets linked to the voter record. So until that application is processed by the county or the city that's processing the absentee, a ballot will not be sent out. So I know in 2020, one of the points of misinformation or just confusion was a lot of absentee ballot applications being mailed to individuals. You didn't request it, but you got it in the mail from maybe a candidate campaign, from a third-party source. And that's perfectly legal for those groups and individuals to send out applications. The only place you're going to get a ballot is from the county or the city that's responsible for sending that out. And it's not going to be mailed without first being entered in as an application and including a ballot ID number. And then on the back end, when that ballot comes back, whether it's returned in person or mailed back in, it undergoes a review of that signature envelope to confirm that the identification number matches what the voter provided on their application. So a ballot doesn't make it all the way through until it can clear those hurdles. As we mentioned, the voter needs to sign. There's a witness signature requirement. So those need to be met before that acceptance and ultimately counting of that absentee ballot takes place. Similar checks that are, of course, in place at the polling place for voting on Election Day.
Melanie, I don't know if you or Paul is the best one, but you mentioned about how your ballot has to be in by Election Day this year. That is the rule that was in existence before 2020. Obviously, it's an exception. So as those ballots get brought into the county, when do they get counted and then reported to the Secretary of State?
I'll let Paul answer this one.
All right.
Sure. So 2020 did see a slight change to a portion of this process. So there was an additional 7 days that were allowed to begin opening those absentee ballot envelopes and starting to process those and feed them through the tabulation equipment. This year, that goes back to what the law had been. So it's a 7-day timeline, 7 days prior to Election Day, when those envelopes are opened and the ballots are fed through that equipment. But no results are generated until 8 p.m. on election night. So that's the same time that the polls close for polling place voting on election day. That's when those absentee results totals are also generated. So nothing is known prior to that 8 o'clock election day timeline.
And then what do we know about kind of the percentage of people who have chosen to vote by mail in Minnesota pre-2020? What was that number, or what was that? Because I think there's still the tradition of wanting to go to the polls, but just understanding kind of how many of those ballots come in early.
I believe going into 2020, I think we were topping out at around 20 to 25% in that range. And then in 2020, we basically doubled that up to about half, more than half of ballots that came in, whether it was early in person or by mail prior to election day. So where we'll land in 2022, it might be somewhere in the middle there, or see it go back closer to where we were, maybe slightly higher than pre-2020.
Melanie, is there a time frame when voters seem to get more interested, when website visits go up or questions come in, in a more rapid manner related to how to vote in Minnesota?
Yeah, it typically coincides with that early voting period that we have here in Minnesota. We can begin voting early 46 days ahead of the election, September 23rd, voting season. And that's typically when we start to see folks more and more interested in voting in the upcoming election. Got it.
As we get going and voting here in a little less than a week, are there things that you want to make sure that Minnesotans know, that they understand the system? Because there has been so much misinformation out there. We want to make sure that people have their facts straight, they have their process straight, or things to maybe look out for that maybe are not above board, that maybe either campaigns, candidates, or third-party groups have tried to do to confuse voters.
Yeah, I would love to take this time to really highlight the new page we have on our website that addresses some of the falsehoods and the disinformation that's out there. We know that Minnesota is not immune to the disinformation, and we still believe that most Minnesotans firmly have faith and confidence in our system. Because we had nearly 80% voter turnout in 2020, that shows me that most Minnesotans do trust the process, even if they may not agree with the outcome. And mnvotes.gov/facts is where you can go to find out exactly the different answers to some of those falsehoods that are out there, some of those myths that are out there. We have links to walk you through the voting process, the ballot process, where, all the way through to really help voters understand that this is how our process works. It's a great tool to use, mnvotes.gov/facts, and please check it out because it's a living document that we'll keep on adding to as we hear more and more questions about voting and the voting process. And that's a great way for anybody to find any information that they need.
I know that Minnesota's, we have multiple ways to register to vote, but if somebody's not registered to vote, maybe they recently moved here, how do they go about that?
You can go to mnvotes.gov, and like I said, your one-stop shop. That is where you can register to vote. You can register to vote online right there at mnvotes.gov. It takes about 3 minutes. You just enter in your information. You will need either your driver's license number or the last 4 digits of your social security, and you just spend that 3 minutes to register to vote. You get confirmation that you have been registered, and it'll let you know where your polling place is. So super easy to register to vote online. You can also print and download a paper form from your local elections office. So we really encourage people to just register right at mnvotes.gov.
Well, last question here as we wrap up this one's form in this segment. When and how tested, A, by local governments that administer, and then B, what role are any part of the
can bring forward equipment, but needs to meet several requirements. The first being testing in federally accredited testing labs. Once that certification is obtained, then it can be brought to the Secretary of State's office for additional certification to ensure that the equipment meets all state election laws, that it can perform to some of the specific features that are unique to Minnesota with our partisan primary ballots. It's able to process those correctly. Once that certification is completed, and there are 3 ballot voting equipment vendors, ballot counters that are certified for use in the state of Minnesota, then counties can have the option to purchase that equipment and use it in their county. Before that equipment is ever used, it undergoes rigorous testing at the county level, and that takes place prior to every single election. So it happened this year before the primary election, and it's going to happen again before the general election, where hundreds, thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of ballots are going to be fed through that equipment to ensure that it is counting the ballots correctly, that it's rejecting ballots that shouldn't be counted. It's if there is an overvote, that it's not counting both votes for that for the candidates in that particular contest, if it's a vote for one. And that process, so it takes place, every piece of equipment is tested that's used in the election, and then a subset of that equipment is tested again at something that's known as the public accuracy test. And so anyone, members of the public, can go to their county or their city and see if their city's doing the administration there, and see that process take place. They can actually watch the ballots be fed through, see the results be printed, and confirm that that equipment is counting the ballots correctly. And then on the back end, there's an audit that takes place after every state general election that verifies the equipment performed as it should have. Minnesota has some of the tightest thresholds in the country when it comes to acceptable variation with the vote counting equipment, and it has always passed where those results from the machines tie out to what that hand count shows following the election in that audit process. And again, that post-election review, that audit is also open to the public. So these are open processes. It's allows for transparency to confirm that the equipment that is used in our elections can be trusted, and that it performs up to the standards that it needs to.
Is there a range of the variation? And some people might just even ask, how can there be a variation if the machine is counting accurate?
And there really isn't any. And I know the threshold, I think, is based on the size of the number of voters. Really what happens when there is the count is off, it's not that the machine has counted it incorrectly. It's a voter determining the voter intent. So if the voter maybe circled the candidate's name as opposed to filling out that oval, the machine is not going to be able to interpret that while it's just going to be reading the ovals. But if you're doing it as a hand count, you're able to catch that, and that might have one or two where that's the case.
Sounds great. Paul Linnell, Deputy Director of Elections, Melanie Hazlip from the Secretary of State's office is the Director of Voter Outreach. Thanks for joining me on this Fluence Forum.
Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Our final segment after this break will be Michael Stahlberger from Blue Earth County and Emily Hunt from Ramsey County. They'll talk about, at the local level, how Minnesota elections are administered. One urban county, one greater Minnesota county. I'm Blois Olson. You're listening to a Fluence Forum presented by AARP of Minnesota. The final segment on this Fluence Forum presented by AARP of Minnesota is talking to local election officials about how locally elections are administered. Emily Hunt joins us from Ramsey County and Michael Stahlberger from Blue Earth County. Emily, Michael, thanks for joining me on this Fluence Forum.
Hi, thanks.
So, Michael, we've got
Thanks
redistricting, new precincts, things like that. How early do you start preparing to administer this election, knowing that the primary was in August and maps were done in what, March?
Exactly. And we had a special election too to work with this
Right.
go around in 1st Congressional District. We start planning the election really when the last election cycle ends. we just start planning our new technology upgrades, anything like that that might be involved. But really getting to the meat of the current election, we would start that pretty much the day after the last one ends, making sure that supplies are getting re-prepared, repacked, and getting all of our voter records updated. So kind of a constant cycle with the elections and preparing and planning for them.
Emily, one of the key elements of local elections is election judges and volunteers. I mean, I know they're compensated, but not a lot. How does it look this year for making sure you have enough people serve as election judges and work the polls?
It's been really remarkable to see folks coming out and offering to serve since the 2020 pandemic. Folks did see a need to both serve the community and to support democracy. We in Ramsey County and throughout the state really have seen a lot of folks step up, and we could not hold elections without election judges. So every year, no matter how little or big an election might be, we count on our election judges who keep our polling places going, and they really help us extend our administration out into the field.
You know, one of the things that I know I'm always curious about, and it feels like every year there's, sometimes we're impatient. Most of the time that's me, but can you each, starting with you, Michael, talk about how you share your election results, how they get processed on election night, how they get inputted, how they get posted to the internet or to the feeds that you have to post to?
Sure, absolutely. You're not alone waiting for those records to get posted. I get that question, that comment all the time. So first off, there's a little known rule in Minnesota. We can't post results until we can match up election day results with precinct results that would be coming in as part of the absentee voting process. So while we might have results right at 8:01 for those absentee or mail ballot voters, we have to wait until our election judges, our precinct level results have been reviewed by those folks and then turned into our office, either brought to the office through some secure channels or through some transfer of data. So we have a little bit of a delay there in and of itself, but then we also have to do a cursory review, right? They're unofficial results until we actually canvass them, but we still want to make sure they're as accurate as possible when we're releasing them on election night. So there's a slight delay with that as well. But once we're able to match up precinct results with absentee results and we do our initial review of them, then we upload them into a secure state software system so that they can actually be pushed out to the Secretary of State's website. And then many counties like Blois, like us here, we release our own results on our own maps as well, just for voters locally. So there's a little bit of a process there. It takes a while, and that's why there's somewhat of a delay.
Emily, Ramsey County, obviously a little more dense than Blue Earth County. But it's interesting to me always how, two precincts right next to each other or, 3 or 4 can take different amounts of time to come in. Any sense of what that process looks like in Ramsey County and how it times out?
Absolutely. We're consistent across the state with Blue Earth County, with other counties in the process and the requirements to report results. But of course, we vary by county, and those very same election judges are working their hardest to go through all the processes to tie up the result, the equipment and everything at the polling places before they then come down to Ramsey County. In other counties, it might work a little different just based on voting systems that we use, and that we all use certified voting systems. But if there is a difference in voting system, it would impact election night in that folks in Ramsey County specifically will drive those results down to our office. And that does take a little time. We appreciate folks when they reach out for the results on election night, but we explain we're doing things as fast as we can on our end. Election judges are too, and ultimately they will be accurate when we post them to the state site. But we tend to in Ramsey County hear that it's a little bit of a delay simply due to folks are driving things down to us.
Just as kind of a final question here, what are the last things that people need to know in these, kind of final 7 weeks in Blue Earth County that they should be aware of and make sure that they understand the process to make our elections safe and secure?
Absolutely. The thing we always remind our voters, especially this time, is to check the registration status. That's one of the easiest things voters can do to help prepare for Election Day, and it adds some level of security, right? Because it allows us to verify out their eligibility to vote. It puts them on the roster so that they can check in and they know they're the only one checking in to vote on Election Day, or they use that to request a ballot as well. So we always encourage folks to make sure the registration's up to date. The other thing I'll add this year is that if folks have any questions at all from Blue Earth County about our process after they've watched this segment or they want to learn more, they can always contact us. We'll gladly talk through the process. We'll explain the way that we do things here. We'll show them whatever we can show them that's available at that time. And we'd rather answer those questions in advance so that they can go to Election Day being very confident in the process and knowing that we are counting every vote.
Emily, how about in Ramsey County? What are the couple quick things that you'd want people to know?
I'll echo Mike's sentiment here. We are consistent in our goals to communicate out to the public, advance of Election Day, on Election Day, throughout our calls with voters, contact with voters, and then after the election. So we're happy to share how processes work, how elections work, and we work year round to prepare for and respond to Election Day. So we are happy to be part of a segment like this, specifically just to show we're interested in educating voters so they can feel confident and knowledgeable when they go in their polling place of how things work and who to talk to if they have questions.
Sounds great. Emily, Michael, thanks for joining me on this Fluence Forum.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
If you caught this Fluence Forum midway through, go to WCCOradio.com. The whole forum will be posted, or visit the WCCO Radio Facebook page where it will also be posted. I'm Blois Olson. Thanks for listening to this Fluence Forum presented by AARP of Minnesota.